The following story was told to me by my mom. I will be reading it from her point of view. I grew up in a small town, where there were many old houses that were owned by the first settlers of the town. The house I grew up in was right in the middle of the town, and one of the bigger homes too. From our main window we could see a hill right across the landscape, and on top of that hill was a stone chimney, surrounded by the foundation of the home, the only remains of what had been a beautiful house according to the older inhabitants of the town. Neighbors would tell tales of that home, and how during the early 1900s the whole town would gather at that house for grand balls and parties. I always wanted to go up to that hill there to see the fireplace remnants and to try and imagine the house, and what I could only imagine as beautiful parties that no longer could take place there. One day I got on my bicycle and rode it towards the hill. The sun was setting, and as I got closer to the old home's abandoned structure, I could see there was a lady near the chimney. Beyond the hill, at the very edge of the town, a cemetery stood in solace. The lady looked at me as I rode up towards her. She then turned away and started to walk towards the cemetery. I kept watching this woman, as I had never seen her before. She looked like she was in her 30s, and I remember her beautiful white eyelet dress with a high neckline. Her hair was dark and she wore it like a braid on top of her head as a bun. I finally arrived at the chimney. It was huge and the atmosphere felt peaceful. I started exploring, and suddenly I looked up and saw the lady waving at me from the cemetery. For some strange reason I did not wave back. I found it strange she would wave, since I really did not know her, and wondered who she was. Months passed and I had forgotten about her until the Day of the Dead arrived, and I went to the cemetery with my family to take flowers and ofrendas to my departed loved ones. We entered the cemetery, laid flowers in the tombs of my family, and I for some reason kept thinking about the lady who had nicely waved at me months before. I walked over to the area from which I remembered seeing her, and to my astonishment there was a beautiful tombstone with a photo engraved of the lady I had seen. I saw her name was Mercedes, and noticed that not a single flower was on her tombstone. I'm pretty sure she'd been long forgotten by her descendants. As a shiver went throughout my spine, I knew what I had to do. I ran back to where my family was hanging around, asked one of my uncles for more flowers. I ran back to the beautiful woman's tombstone. I got down on my knees, laid some flowers by her photograph, and prayed for Mercedes's eternal rest. This story happened to my dad. Keep in mind this was in the 1950s in a very small town of Mexico. My dad says that when he was about 6 years old he would go super early in the mornings to his town's church and help the priest with tolling the church bells. He would walk miles, alone, in the dark desert to get to the church. His job was to open the church doors, go to the bell tower and wait for 5:30 a.m. so he could start tolling the bells. No one else, not even the priest, would show up until about 5:45 or even 6. He said some mornings the doors were already unlocked and other doors would be ajar. That wasn't supposed to happen, since he was supposed to be there alone, but he wouldn't ask any questions once the priest showed up. He didn't want to miss his cue for the bells or get in trouble for meddling. On other mornings, he says he'd walk up to open the doors and they'd unlatch and slowly creak open just before he could even put his hands on them. He did this early morning routine for several months. Every Sunday he'd have to wake up around 4 a.m. to get a good head start so he could be at the church on time. One morning, my dad was running a few minutes late, so he started running to the church. As he ran toward the end of the town, he stopped right next to a tree to rest for a few seconds. He kept looking forward, catching his breath, and he was about to start running again when he heard a sort of squeak. He thought it was a dog or even a coyote off in the distance, but he heard it again. This time he realized that the squeak was coming from above him. He slowly gazed up towards the tree's huge branches, and what he saw still gives him chills. He saw 2 feet, swinging side to side. With every swing, he saw more and more of a man's body, hanging from the tree. Naturally, he let out a scream and started his run with even more speed this time. He finally arrived to the church, practically throwing himself at the church's entrance to catch his breath and calm his nerves. He then had to quietly calm himself down because he heard something coming from inside the church. He put his ear up against the crack between the doors and he heard whispers. He then grew confused because he had to be the only person there and the doors were still locked, yet he heard what seemed like praying and whispering, as if Mass had begun already. He shook his head in disbelief. He squeezed his ear even harder between the doors and he heard silence followed by singing. He quickly recognized the song. They were singing a song that was common for funerals. He stood up quickly and started unlocking the door. The singing grew louder and what he could only describe as more aggressive. He threw the doors open and everything went silent. The church was how he usually found it, dark, empty, and musty.